I would like to begin by asking a quick question to ourselves, and we've talked about this a little bit already this morning, and the question is, what exactly is happiness? Many people around the world think of happiness as a specific single emotional experience, and they think of it as many experiences of pleasure, or having your needs met really quickly all the time. And what we've come to begin to understand, and what I mean by having your needs met is having maybe delicious food, or getting lots of respect and praise from other people, or having lots of luxurious possessions and comforts. But scientific examinations of happiness have begun to show that this idea of happiness is unreachable. And it's unreachable for a couple of reasons that we Western scientists call adaptation. And adaptation is when you have something that is comfortable and pleasurable today, if you have more and more and more, it becomes less pleasurable. It is not too different from the idea of impermanence. The other reason why this kind of happiness is unreachable is something called social comparison. And social comparison is when we have something and we see that someone else has something nicer or better than what we have, and we want what they have because what we have isn't as good as what they have. So it's always wanting more, and this is not too different from self-grasping. So we see there's these parallels between the sort of contemplative forms of ignorance that make happiness difficult and what Western researchers are beginning to understand are limitations or challenges to happiness. All right. So it turns out when we really study people who are very happy, what's unique about the happiest people is that they experience a rich, wide, and flexible realm of emotional experiences. They don't always experience pleasure. They're not always smiling. They have a lot of different kinds of emotional experiences, and they savor the ones that are positive, and they recover quickly from the ones that are negative. The second key property of people who are happiest when we look at their lives is they tend to have a rich and supportive network of social contacts. They have friends, family, community who they can depend on and who depend on them for day in and day out experiences. So I want to tell you about a little project that I did with some of my colleagues at Berkeley working with Facebook. We worked with well, you got the next slide? So as you can see in the slide in front of you, the way that I've defined happiness is it's a state of existence in the world which involves having a range of emotional experiences, being resilient, which means quickly adjusting when things go wrong, having an inner awareness of your emotions so that you can use them in a way that's most productive and adaptive. And in fact, you can try to maximize your experience of what we call pro-social emotions. And these are emotions that orient you, that motivate you towards the well-being of other people. And then finally, being enmeshed in a supportive social community. So with Facebook, we wanted to provide people with little signals of a lot of different kinds of emotions. And so what you're looking at are sketches that were created by an animator, an artist who works at Pixar. And Pixar is a movie company that created films that maybe you've seen, like Monsters University or Toy Story. So one of their artists, we asked him to make sketches of different emotional experiences, and we turned these sketches of these different emotional experiences into little signals that people could use on Facebook. And so you'll see that the artist came up with some expressions for anger and contempt and disgust, some expressions for fear and sadness and pain. some expressions that communicate regret, an expression that communicates boredom, and expressions that express interest. So if you're speaking with somebody and you like the story they're telling, you might make a particular face for that. He also created sketches that express enjoyment, an emotion which we call awe, and the experience of affection. And affection is this a desire to connect with another person in an intimate and close way. Further on, he made sketches for us that communicate amusement and pride, that sense of being pleased with an achievement that you have accomplished, or perhaps even a sympathetic pride, being proud of somebody else who has achieved something. And then finally, we have expressions for what you might call love. And what we did was we looked at how people all over the world use these, what we call emoticons, little signals of emotions. And what we thought when we went into the study is that nations that use the most positive emotions would be the ones that had the most success, right? That the ones that had the highest literacy rates and the lowest infant mortality and the most success as a nation. And we were wrong. What we found was that the nations which used the biggest range of emotions, that communicated their emotions in the most dynamic and widespread way, were the ones that performed the best. We also found that the expression, the sharing of emotional information that was regular over time, not in big spurts with big gaps and then spurts, but just every day sharing a little bit about your emotions, was associated with better functioning as a nation. And so this was a really big eye-opener for us, that in fact, again, happiness is not about pleasure and always having positive emotions, but rather happiness comes from a rich and wide diversity of emotional experiences, including things like anger and disgust. But the important step is not to get carried away by anger. If you have anger because there's injustice, it's important to use that feeling to motivate a solution to that injustice, not to use that motivation to lash out in violence. So what we know about happiness and negative emotions is that people who recover quickly from negative emotions are the ones who also can experience the world in the happiest way. So it's very sensible to have sadness, very sensible to experience anger. They're giving me a new one. Okay, this one's good?
Yeah.
Okay, hello, yes. But the challenge is, how can you relate to these negative emotional experiences, and again, in a way that is constructive and productive, and not in a way that is harmful to oneself. What you're looking at in the slide on the left is a chart which shows you over time the relationship between the sort of common thread of negative emotions, which is a stressful arousal, and your ability to function or perform in a given context. And what we know is that very little feeling or almost no feeling or stress is associated with perhaps being almost asleep or not being very effective. Having too much stress, which is on the right side of the curve on the left, is associated with a failure, right, and performance diminishing. We don't do well when we are feeling very angry or very stressed out or very sad. There is an optimal level of stress which helps us function in the world in an adaptive way. On the right side, I'm showing you a figure from a study where people were asked to do compassion meditation, and then they were presented with a stressful task. They were asked to give a speech in front of a large audience about something they don't know anything about. So what you see is the line which has circles at each point are the people who did the meditation, and the line which has squares are the people who did not do a meditation. And it turns out that something about the inner awareness and the compassion focus of that experience made that group more resilient to the stress. They felt less worried and less, their body, their physiology, the cortisol, which is a stress hormone in their blood, was less rampant when they had this practice of doing some meditation. Another piece of happiness which I brought up was this idea of inner awareness, this idea of knowing what's happening in your own mind, when it's happening, and being able to be decisive about what to do when you have an emotional experience. And what we know from Western research on mindfulness is that training in mindfulness, and mindfulness is something like meditation, but adapted in a secular way for Western audiences. When people do mindfulness, they show improvements in health, both if they're well or if they are from a clinical population. And you'll hear more specific studies of this later on tomorrow from researchers in the room who are doing that work. We know that mindfulness is beneficial when somebody who has a disease is having a different treatment but does mindfulness as well. The benefits are even stronger. And we also know that mindfulness reduces distress and anxiety and depression. And one of the suggested mechanisms for that is that it enables people to disentangle their fear or their pain from their anxiety about what's happening to them. So inner awareness is an important part of resilience and an important part, in turn, of happiness. And now moving on to the role of social community, of social connections to happiness. We know on the flip side, if a young child doesn't have a supportive parent environment, they don't have an adult who shows them a version of the world that is safe and trustworthy, that person will grow up and have lifelong risk for certain kinds of psychological disorders, and they will also have difficulty having satisfying and pleasant relationships in life. So we know that from the very beginning, having a safe, trusting connection with the people around us is critical to our health and well-being, and in turn, happiness. We know that when you're lonely, you have cardiovascular risk. Researchers who study loneliness and the heart have shown that if you are lonely, you are more likely to suffer from a heart attack than if you're not. We also know that when you're excluded, if we play a game and it's, passing a ball, and there are 3 people and one person never gets the ball, and you scan their brain while that's happening, their area of their brain that signals pain, right, that usually comes on if they get a cut on their hand, that area gets active because it's painful, essentially and fundamentally, for us to be socially excluded. There's an entire literature in Western psychology on the role of kindness in happiness, and this is perhaps surprising to the average Western person who thinks that it's more important to pay attention to their own possessions than to think about how valuable it is to be kind and charitable and give away some of their own possessions. What we've learned from the work of Elizabeth Dunn and others is that giving away some of your own resources actually leads to greater happiness, and also leads to activation in reward and pleasure centers in the brain. So we're wired biologically to feel pleasure in the moments that we are kind to others. Cooperation is another quality of connection and community, and what we understand from studying people who are playing games, and we give some people the opportunity to cooperate, that is, work together to a common goal, and other people opportunities to compete, where one person wins and the other person loses. The people that cooperate have greater happiness, and the reward and pleasure centers in their brain are more active when they cooperate and someone cooperates back with them. So we understand at a biological level and a psychological level that cooperation and kindness are fundamentally pleasing and contributing in substantial ways to happiness. So to sort of simplify this model, the idea is that the science of happiness is beginning to show that through our own emotional harmony, and that is having lots of emotions but adapting to them flexibly, having close relationships that are cooperative and generous, and supportive, it leads to this greater sense of human connection and common humanity, which is very much similar to interdependence. The more friends and people that we feel connected to, the more likely that we're going to endorse an idea of common humanity, and that through this sequence we end up maximizing our potential for happiness. One of the things I wanted to share is that to really communicate these ideas in more detail and more richly, my colleagues and I at the Greater Good Science Center have created something called a massive open online course called The Science of Happiness, where anyone in the world for free can follow 8 weeks of teaching about all of the literature and all the research that has looked at what contributes to happiness and what doesn't contribute to happiness in the very sort of similar topics that I've just discussed. This is one of the ways that we hope that we can communicate to people around the world what is a more promising pursuit of happiness than the idea that we started with, which is that happiness is about pleasure and getting your needs met. Now we understand that happiness is much more closely aligned with our ability to be kind, to feel connected, and to cooperate with other people, combined with a tendency towards positive emotions, an experience of negative emotions, and a resilience to recover from those negative emotions quickly. So, thank you very much.
So, in order to have real happiness, what does the life of other sentient beings to do with it? How happiness
is there any connection with the lives of other people?
Other sentient beings, in order to have genuine happiness.
The research suggests that our happiness relies a lot on our ability to have a sense of community. I don't know enough about how my happiness is influenced by the happiness of somebody very far away. So I don't know if the horrible experiences that people are having in Africa are as closely dependent to my happiness as the people who I see day in and day out. But I would hope that as people practice common humanity, that they would concern themselves with the suffering of people very far away. I don't think that happiness means you feel pleasure all the time. I think happiness involves necessarily sometimes feeling sadness. And sometimes that sadness is knowing that other people are suffering and not feeling like there's anything you can do about it. If you want to translate?
Ta yang ta be digi se de da simjin shing tseso se dini po dewa condition mi se di tsawe ne sheshing mindus tsere ge to ne nyamshi pangda khar yoris la bi na ani mi ger chira ba chi gi ani digi gi ne dan di khande chigla ra li yoris la bi na koran ne se ki kuryu ki nanglo la ani mi shenda jizo ki nanglo dewa sanglo condition mi de la ra li yowa di pangda yores di mayim she nga dan dewa chi me me shemba ji ki digi sigenere me shemba ji ki dunge sigenere me shemba ji ki tseso da nge ki digi la dewa khande shme ha da ha ku mindu special sana afriki lingjeng nanglo la mi mangu chi dunge nyang di yore di dunge nyang me ki ken che che digi dunge da nge ki digi ni phala mixe dewa yore se chik cheta bi mare simbina kar yore slavi bina ani chik nga zo dewa mi chik gyor imbe ken dushe ki samlu di ani chik kumbel chungbimbe ani kunzula dunge ki sambe ki ani samlo di yongu yores cheza da dila du zambala kunzu ki dunge la samne kirang kabre khar yong sigres la na ani samba medewa yong sigres dunge yong sigres cheza digi se di korang takwa resh ani dewa yong de chigla digi shagyo mares manzu ki digi se di ani kabre ani dunge yong goya dinde da dunge yong we ki ne ka kashi ani an digi ki ani chashi chadoya cheza dile zambada tangi digi thendam ki digi se di dewa nyong dewa maimba ani simjur ki rik mangbo chi ani nyong thobya ki nuba yawa chila ani digi sha imbas.
I was going to give one other scientific finding related to that, which is that our brains are exquisitely attuned to the emotional expressions of other people. When we see another person in pain, our brain represents a painful sensation in ourselves that is the same mechanism, the same structures that represent our own pain if we're having a pain. Now, we don't always feel that pain when we see that pain, but we feel something. We have a sensation. And so for us to be surrounded by unhappy people is probably deleterious to our happiness. And to be surrounded by happy people is a boost to our happiness.
Teganaji pandagi nyamship ki panda yobe ke nezuji kharcha ki yores labi bina ani nganzu ki lebadi khandes res labi khandes cha de yores lana pingu toni mishimbe ki ani nezule teje mishimba gadu gu sowa khari nyungu yowa dela teje ani dinde ki gadu gu sowa zo thong yu zambala susu ki samgam gnang lol yimbe ne ya didan dewe ki ani sorwa chitung yores cheza da dila ju zambala parobo dungye nyang dewa ji thong yimbe na kera dungye chikba nyungu yores je ani shetu mar de yimbe na didan dewe ki ani simsur chik ani kerang ki samluk nang lol tu yungu yores cheza da dila ju zambala kerang ani mi dungye yang de yo chik nang lol dew yimbe na ani kerang la ani dungye nya ki ani chen yung sia chik da kuryu nang lol mi sangma ani samba kyu yoba digi da tembe ki ani kuryu chik nang lol dew yimbe na kerang la ya ani diga na shin ki ani shukyen sangbo yung de ya dine chik yung yores.
Emily, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I mean, I was thinking about a couple of issues which I think I would like to continue to think and discuss with you later as well. One question is happiness being such a fundamental, well, I wouldn't say need, but a fundamental value, if I put it, fundamental value. Can we describe happiness as unconditional? Because even if it has to depend upon good people, good circumstances, that is still circumstantial. So, which means your happiness is decided by something external to you, because there are also other theories which says that happiness is unconditional, and which is the unconditional happiness which gives contentment. Because I think the distinction which we make between happiness and pleasure also has to bring in the idea of contentment. Who is the contented person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that question. So I didn't mean to convey that happiness was dependent on external circumstances at all. I think that happiness largely emerges as some inner capacity or ability, but certainly our day in and day out experiences are a dynamic interaction between who we are and what's happening around us. And there are people who have very little. My children visited a slum in Dharamsala last week, and they were heartbroken and heart-warmed by the happiness that they saw in these children who were their age, who had almost nothing to be comfortable in. And so I don't think happiness is a function of circumstances, but I do think circumstances influence and sort of stimulate us to respond in both sort of reflexive and habitual, but also in sort of deliberate and purposeful ways.
Gela morangi tiwa dikhares la vimina ani digi se di ani ta sheze ki ani ta rindang jik yunden jik cha di yores cheza ta di kirangi shedan che vimbina ani chi kin kuryula tune ani yongguya tinde ki keje she sons cheza shedan shemba jik she vimbina ani digi se di na samlu ko tone yongwa dilla ju sambala ki kin kuryula ma tune ani digi se di yong tobya chigda tinde ki samlo dang dang jik tone ani ta cho shemba se tinde ki ani samlo le ko ya tinde ki keje shi gres cheza da di mindumba do chek do disol kiran samju karyo la so cheza da di tiwe di ki len de la res nge keje de she yung du sambala digi se di ani chi kin kuryu ki ne dang ki chen cheba ma do na samlo ko tone yong ma tob je chi res sig mes so di na samlo ki tone yong go ya chek yores imbe ina yang ani chigin khuryu gi chen chigre weslana chigre samgyus pecha shavena nge gi pudun zo khasan de gya ge chongse yin dan da panggo desa din de chindu zambala de le yebe gi pudun zo ani tungge shembu shu shyor din imbe na koran zo tando ani gawe ki ani samloda 제모제 대와 통도 잠발라 아니 kondu changma ani jik namgyu chongmanyu geta didan tumbe kisim zor sangbo dinde lesha jeza dilla zambala chin kuryu ki chen chigres imbi ne ya ani nangni yonggo ya jik zo chag yor samgudus
데 samjo chu shu shongshi ta dewa cha mo sam shi ta chidang tang dang zo gela gi deji gi thön do jo mi dewa dang dega nang shin chamze thöngyur gi kanle chu jong go song so wa dende song ka so la tanda chidang zo da chi cherik bare dega nang shin zo nang ba sang ji be ngone she so ta jo mi deji tun tab gi thola an labar do tanda cherik ba do cha wa na chi ngo bu zug jung gi thon ta ba do jo mi deji gi thön do la ani shabdemui gal ganzam shu ro teganang sing ngazo namba sangji ba do cha jana misi gi da nangsim gi nyamleng gi thone ani jomi gi deji re teganang sing gi chamje tende shabdu shu wa nang sing gi ta tanda gela gi tanda deji ko tanda ta gela morang girbi ngoni deji la na me do dewa ti tanda ani mabu song su de ta ngarang gi samsul tanda namba sangji bi thone chidang dewa de dongal na chidang di thon mangbo shira re ani thega indo ngaran samsu dodo shiwa na chidang degi lana re dewa lana mendu dungel lana changma ani sem la rag le gres ro sem la rag le gres tedi kesi susu gi sem di ngo she tini yang da ba ji ha ko na ani dewe ju cha go res kesi tini ngo mi she an de la thul tende yemedina ani tisama ani dongal ge ani yunan chagres pene cha shana ngazo chidan ta jamling din na la mi rabring thasum mangbo ye na ne pene cha shana mi nyamjung da cha shewana korang la toge nimaji la dangay sam meba tende khabdo la susurani yang tela choshe ba ani tela deba chimjin deba no korang la chik dewa de deji ge chonang de yungo res tega na shi mi chukbo do cha she ba na kola ju penjor khazu yo ba na tela choma she ba da tela ani deba ma sim ba tela yanjur achik ma wa da tela yanjur ka ma ma ra ge tindi ge sambe gu ne lang de korang la ju penjor khazu yo ba tindi ge ani dewa tuntu ge yo ma res ro an tindi ende ta chana mixi ge da gela chana na pangza cheri bi da chering ba sim bi cha ne tanda dirwa penachashana mi ta tindigi the draw mi gi deji gi tuntabla penachashana mi ta nyamchung la na mi neba shyo chashara mi penachashan tingsa mi pe misibi ta zadabo ta ten khang da do shyo na ani gela charangi ro mixi gi da cherik bene tingsa ta mixi ge temba nyesha ko la tanda mindfulness mango sonsura tinde thola mixi ge gela charangi meditation and gom nyamling ton ke shewa na tingsa music ngolen che mar tela ngazo khala na chulu gda de kyabjong chik chulu da ni tadu ko le chik kyabjong shuk chembo je chane tila khelengi mares tinde de temba nyesha la samta na mindfulness mixi ge chocho da dewa me ba mixi ge sem ge nyamling de yitun thab tinde to sungure dela ni che samju khande yustis.
He said that as a part of a comment, he said that when we talk about genuine happiness, it has to come from your mind, not from the external circumstances. And that's why we talk about the importance of contentment in Buddhist practice and Buddhist traditions. So, and if you are contented by mentally or consciously, then with very little things you can have a very happy mental state. And when you talk about this mindfulness meditation in your presentation, because since mindfulness is a kind of have a connotation of religious background, and the religious philosophical background, many people may have difficulties in accepting this kind of training programs. And when you try to have included people in this kind of programs, do you face face difficulties in people participating in your programs?
Yes, there is some resistance to meditation, to contemplative exercises, to mindfulness, but that resistance is fading. And one of the reasons is because of the work of some of my colleagues out here in the audience who you'll hear from tomorrow. As researchers and scientists, and particularly people studying clinical populations, they're part of the medical field, as they begin to show with data that these practices are beneficial, that they do heal people, that they do lead to improvement, then our societies begin to embrace them as not religious, but as actually a secular method, as a viable treatment.
Gelakirang ki samjudi ini jela thiwadin kiwadis tanche ini tanda temba nyesha di chulu ki gyamgyung ki nizu yawa sonza ani tanda Quran su ki nyamshib lan sushuk chingi mi kange ti dues laimba cheza di tanda kange du nyung du goya gyumzen khawaris la bimbena ani ta chika meng ta tende gongo mangbu chil ten mi mangbu shi ki nyamshi chedi gor nyamchip chene pendo yawa thongdu zambala ani ta minzu nyi ma yungudus.
Is there a difference in the way your consciousness changes when you see a beautiful thing and feel attached to that thing versus when you see some animals in pain and you feel compassion?
Cheza ani chala ning jiwu chi ton che dila kira ani chabu ke lo kewa tha di mai bi ke simjin shimba ji kangen te dewa ta nazu dang de vik simjin ji thong win bena dini ning ki phala kiran ki ani shewala chewa khari yores shewala gywa du yor bestu.
The two experiences that the question asked about are perceptually and emotionally distinct. And what our perceptual apparatus sort of consumes at any given moment shapes our experience and the way we relate to the world in that moment. And so if you see something beautiful that you want close to you in a moment, you will have a different emotional and motivational experience than if you see an animal suffering in pain and you are inclined to help them. So I think that in terms of how you feel in those two different times, yes, they're different. Is your consciousness different? I don't think so. I think you're still the same person, but you're feeling two different things, and in those moments you're recalling different kinds of memories that are related to those two different experiences.
Tadi wangsur da simzur nyingi gi chane ane nezu mandawa nyi chadi gyores chat kira ane jik chala nyingi wosh thong deda ane tha nyewo chindu yobe lo ji shar yungdu sambala dedan derwe ki ane ta konzu chi ki wangsur sigda wangbo da dewa yobe chorwa jikda chorwa jore dela tene ane deda ring thumbe ki nangi simzur ji yungu yores ta emotional simzur ji yungu yores tega nashi ane simje ta jik nazu tan de nyi simje jing thong yungdu sambala dedan derwe ki kirang ki wangsur ki chikda an tiga nashi ane samlu samgam simzor di ane loga ji yungu yores yimbi na ane shewa loga yime gywa du yores ya dinde ane nye shetu samares jazata yimbi na nezu dini ni thongwa da ane thongwa dila pawe ki yanlen tega du sambala jig temba da dedan dewe ki temba da ane shewe ki chashi mangbo jig dinang lol su dia ji yungu yores.
You talk about lots of emotions. And you talk about like a feeling of pain when you are excluded or ostracized from a certain group. And also you talk about the pain, physical pain, when your heart is cut or injured. So I think these two different types of pain. One is a mental pain, and another is physical pain. So do they activate in a different part of brain, or do they activate the same brain? If they activate at the same region of, if both of them activate at some part of, one part of the brain, then do they have a different pathway? Because, when I think about if you have a cut at your finger or wherever, I can imagine, some pathway involves there. the action potential and neurotransmitter go silent pathway. But if there's a mental pain, and I cannot imagine some sort of pathway that goes and through the neurotransmitter goes through and activate some kind of the brain region. Yes.
Just that the ones that think the deal you towards Tanji any Moranki Kejeshe Nanglola me Shembajik Dungi Tongwek Kapsula any Kiran Tunga Kaps Tiganashi Kiran Rani any Kiso Nema mid Lik Peach Zemo in the Zemo Chilo Pidu Zambala any Semla Dungish Nazuch Tangires. Just a dig Nazu did the any Nazu Kamba the Lapado Mas Caps Luki any Nazu Jungaro Dini any cheaper race Sonso Morangi. Just that the Koran Lenachik Stemki Nazuda. Naza signal Nazuda, Chick Luke Nazure some goods, the new lower some goods, Tiganashi, once in select on Kejashi and Zambala, Nazuki Kejashi to Zambala, Chick, and Anzuki, one second timber, Tiganashi, one second Salam said in Kejashi race. So Lula Mas Diki and Nazuki Kejashi to Zambala, the Deki, and Chick, one second timber, Tiganashi, Nazu did and Teveki, and one second Salam Sido, pathways here, Tenzo, and exam for two dos. Imbena same ki Nazu Sidu Zambala, and the Deki, and Salamjik near 2 minutes. Cheta Dinini Logare Samgadus, Tacharan Chipa Residu Zambala, and the Zusama Lebe Kine Chigla Turgu Yerve, Salam Chigla Turgu Yerve, Logare Kares.
So when we study pain, we do think of it as having at least two dimensions, and one of them is the physical sensation, and one of them is the unpleasantness. In one study that looked at experienced meditators, it showed that if we apply pain, they feel the sensation just as strongly as non-meditators. But when you ask about pleasantness or unpleasantness, their ratings, how much they say it's unpleasant, is much lower for the meditators than for the non-meditators. And that distinction is supported by different areas in the brain that become activated when people feel pain. For example, cutting your hand, there's a sensory area in your somatosensory cortex which will signal something happened on my hand. But there is another area along the midline in the structure called the anterior cingulate, which signals the distress or the unpleasantness or the maybe fear or anxiety that comes with pain. And that is the area that is shared when you have a mental, something like social exclusion, and when you have a physical pain. So pain is not just one area, it's several, and then some of them overlap if you're feeling physical and mental or social pain.